The sun was setting over the dusty town of San Rafael when Jake Morrison rode in with the cattle drive. His horse was tired, his clothes were dirty, and his throat was drier than the desert they'd just crossed. But Jake had money in his pocket and a swagger in his step that made heads turn as he walked down the main street. Jake was 26 years old and thought he knew everything about life. He'd been working ranches since he was 14, could ride any horse that walked, and was faster with a gun than most men twice his age. More than that, he was lucky. Real lucky, especially when it came to cards. The saloon was full of cowboys, traders, and local folks when Jake pushed through the swinging doors. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the sound of laughter. Jake ordered a whiskey and looked around for a card game. It didn't take long to find one. In the back corner sat a table of well-dressed men playing poker. Jake could tell they had money by their clean clothes and fancy watches. One man stood out from the rest. He was older, maybe 50, with silver hair and a perfectly trimmed beard. His suit looked expensive, and he wore a gold ring that caught the lamplight. This was clearly someone important. Jake walked over with his drink. "Mind if I join you, gentlemen?" The older man looked up with dark, intelligent eyes. "Of course, senor. I am Don Ricardo Valdez. Please sit." Jake introduced himself and bought into the game. The other players were local businessmen and a couple of ranch owners. The stakes weren't too high at first, just enough to make things interesting. Jake won the first few hands easily. His luck was running hot, just like always. As the night wore on, Jake kept winning. He could read the other players like open books. Don Ricardo was good, but he played too carefully. The businessmen were nervous and folded too quickly. Jake's pile of chips kept growing bigger. Don Ricardo was getting frustrated. Jake could see it in the way his jaw tightened each time he lost a hand. The older man started betting more aggressively, trying to win back his losses, but Jake's luck held strong. "You play very well, Senor Morrison," Don Ricardo said, dealing another hand. "Perhaps too well." Jake grinned and took another sip of whiskey. "Just born lucky, I guess." "Luck," Don Ricardo repeated slowly. "Yes, luck can be a dangerous thing. It makes a man confident, sometimes too confident." The game continued. Jake won hand after hand. The other players started dropping out one by one, leaving just Jake and Don Ricardo facing each other across the table. The pile of money in the center kept growing larger. Don Ricardo's face was getting redder with each loss. Jake could see the man's pride was hurt. Rich folks like him weren't used to losing to common cowboys. Jake was enjoying every minute of it. "Another hand?" Don Ricardo asked, his voice tight. "Sure thing," Jake said, leaning back in his chair. "I got all night." Don Ricardo dealt the cards. Jake looked at his hand and tried not to smile. 3 kings. It was a strong hand, maybe strong enough to finish this game once and for all. "I'll bet everything," Don Ricardo said suddenly, pushing all his remaining chips into the center of the table. Jake looked at the pile. There had to be more money there than he made in a whole year of ranch work. His heart started beating faster. This could set him up for life. "That's a lot of money," Jake said carefully. "Too much for a cowboy?" Don Ricardo asked with a slight smile. Jake's pride flared up. Nobody called him out like that. "I can cover it." But when Jake counted his chips, he realized he was short. He'd won a lot, but not quite enough to match Don Ricardo's bet. He looked at his 3 kings again. It was such a good hand. He hated to fold now. "Problem, Senor Morrison?" Don Ricardo asked. "Just thinking," Jake said, trying to figure out what to do. That's when Don Ricardo made his offer. "Perhaps we can make this more interesting. I have a proposition for you." Jake looked up. "What kind of proposition?" "If you win this hand, you take all the money on the table." "But if I win—" Don Ricardo paused, his dark eyes gleaming. "If I win, you must marry my daughter." The saloon got quiet. Everyone at nearby tables had stopped talking to listen. Jake felt like someone had thrown cold water on him. "Marry your daughter?" Jake repeated. "That's crazy," Don Ricardo shrugged. "You said you were lucky. Prove it." Jake's head was spinning. The whiskey wasn't helping him think clearly. He looked at his cards again. 3 kings. When would he ever get a hand this good again? And the money on the table was more than he'd ever seen in one place. "I don't even know your daughter," Jake said. "Her name is Isabella. She is 23 years old and very beautiful. You would be lucky to have her as a wife." Jake laughed, but it sounded forced even to his own ears. "And if I say no?" Then you fold and everyone in this town knows that the big brave cowboy was afraid to back up his words. That did it. Jake's pride wouldn't let him back down now. Every eye in the place was on him. He could hear whispers from the other tables. If he folded now, he'd never live it down. Fine, Jake said, his voice louder than he intended. You got yourself a bet. Don Ricardo smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Excellent. Show your cards, Senor Morrison. Jake laid down his 3 kings with confidence. Read them and weep. Don Ricardo looked at Jake's cards for a long moment. Then slowly he laid down his own hand. 4 aces. The blood drained from Jake's face. 4 aces. He'd never seen a hand that good in all his years of playing cards. The room seemed to spin around him. Impossible, Jake whispered. Nothing is impossible, senor, Don Ricardo said, gathering up the cards. Luck, as I said, can be dangerous. It makes a man think he cannot lose. Jake stared at the table, unable to believe what had just happened. His lucky streak was over. More than over. He was ruined. Don't look so worried, Don Ricardo said, standing up from the table. Isabella is a wonderful girl. You will be very happy together. Now wait just a minute, Jake started to say, but Don Ricardo held up his hand. A bet is a bet, Senor Morrison. Surely a man of your word wouldn't try to back out now. Jake looked around the saloon. Every face was staring at him. Some looked shocked, others amused, but all were waiting to see what he would do. If he tried to back out now, his reputation would be destroyed. No one would ever respect him again. When? Jake asked quietly. The wedding will be in 1 week, Don Ricardo said. That will give you time to prepare yourself. My men will escort you to my ranch tomorrow morning. Don Ricardo walked toward the door, then turned back. Oh, and Senor Morrison, I suggest you get some rest. Tomorrow your new life begins. Jake sat alone at the table long after Don Ricardo left. The other men had gone back to their drinks and conversations, but Jake could still feel their eyes on him. He'd gambled away his freedom to a complete stranger, and there was no way out. He finished his whiskey and stumbled out into the night air. Above him, the stars were shining bright and clear, but for Jake Morrison, everything had suddenly gone very dark indeed. Jake barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those 4 aces staring back at him. By morning, he was hoping it had all been a bad dream caused by too much whiskey. But when 2 Mexican riders showed up at his hotel just after sunrise, he knew it was all too real. The riders didn't say much during the long journey to the Valdez ranch. They just pointed the direction and rode alongside him like guards. Jake tried to make conversation, but they only nodded politely and kept their thoughts to themselves. As they rode through the countryside, Jake got his first real look at Don Ricardo's land. It stretched as far as the eye could see in every direction. Rolling hills covered with cattle, fields of crops, and workers tending to everything with care. This wasn't just a ranch, it was like a small kingdom. The main house came into view around midday, and Jake's jaw nearly dropped. He'd been expecting a simple ranch house, maybe a little bigger than most. Instead, he saw what looked like a palace. The building was huge, made of white stone with red tile roofs. Beautiful gardens surrounded it, and fountains sparkled in the sunlight. Holy cow, Jake whispered to himself. The riders led him to the front entrance, where servants came out to take his horse. Jake felt underdressed in his simple cowboy clothes. Everything here spoke of wealth and class, things he'd never been around before. Don Ricardo was waiting in a grand entryway with marble floors and paintings on the walls. He looked different in his own house, more powerful, more in control. Welcome to Hacienda Valdez, Don Ricardo said with a slight bow. I trust your journey was comfortable? It was fine, Jake replied, looking around at the fancy decorations. This is some place you got here. Thank you. It has been in my family for 3 generations. Now I'm sure you're eager to meet your bride. Jake's stomach twisted. In all his worrying about the situation, he'd tried not to think too much about the actual woman he was supposed to marry. What if she was ugly? What if she was cruel? What if she hated him on sight? She doesn't know about the arrangement? Jake asked. Don Ricardo's expression darkened slightly. Isabella knows everything. She is not happy about it, but she understands her duty to the family. That didn't sound good. Jake followed Don Ricardo through hallways filled with expensive furniture and artwork. Everything was perfect and beautiful, making Jake feel like a bull in a china shop. They stopped outside a heavy wooden door. Don Ricardo knocked gently. Isabella, your husband-to-be is here. Jake heard footsteps, then the door opened. What he saw took his breath away. The woman standing before him was absolutely stunning. She had long black hair that shone like silk, dark eyes that seemed to look right through him, and skin the color of warm honey. She wore a simple but elegant dress that showed she had good taste and style, but it wasn't just her beauty that struck Jake. It was the intelligence in her eyes and the way she held herself. Proud, confident, and clearly not afraid of anyone or anything. "So," she said in perfect English, "you're the cowboy who gambled away his freedom." Her voice was smooth and educated. Nothing like the simple Mexican girls Jake had met in border towns. This woman was different. This woman was dangerous. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said, taking off his hat. "Pleased to meet you, miss." "It's Isabella Valdez," she replied coolly. "Soon to be Isabella Morrison, I suppose." Though I had no say in the matter. The anger in her voice was clear, but it was controlled anger. She wasn't going to scream or cry. She was going to make her feelings known in other ways. "Look," Jake said, "I know this whole thing is strange. Maybe we can work something out." Isabella laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Work something out like what? You think you can just charm your way out of this mess you've created?" "I didn't create anything," Jake said, his own temper starting to rise. "Your father made that crazy bet, not me." "And you took it," Isabella shot back. "You were perfectly willing to gamble with someone else's life when you thought you would win." Jake had no answer for that because she was right. He had been ready to take Don Ricardo's money without thinking about what might happen if he lost. Don Ricardo stepped between them. "Perhaps we should discuss the wedding arrangements." "The ceremony will be tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow?" Jake said. "That's awfully fast." "Why wait?" Isabella asked with a bitter smile. "After all, this isn't about love or getting to know each other. It's just a business transaction, isn't it?" Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. This woman had a sharp tongue, and she wasn't afraid to use it. The rest of that day was a blur of wedding preparations. Jake was given a room in the main house and told to rest. But rest was impossible with Isabella's words echoing in his head. She was right. He had treated this like a business deal without thinking about the real person involved. That evening, Jake tried to find Isabella to talk to her alone. He wanted to apologize, or at least try to understand what she was thinking. He found her in the library, a huge room filled with books from floor to ceiling. She was reading by lamplight, completely absorbed in whatever book she held. Jake cleared his throat and she looked up with those intelligent dark eyes. "What do you want?" she asked. "I wanted to talk. About tomorrow. About all this." Isabella closed her book and set it aside. "What is there to talk about?" "Tomorrow we'll stand in front of a priest, say some words, and then we'll be married. Whether we want to be or not." "It doesn't have to stay that way," Jake said. "Maybe after some time passes we can get it annulled or something." "Annulled?" Isabella stood up, her eyes flashing. "Do you think this is some kind of game? Do you have any idea what this marriage means for me?" Jake was confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've spent my entire life preparing to marry someone who would respect me and my family. Instead, I'm being forced to marry a man who sees me as nothing more than the prize in a card game." "That's not true," Jake protested, though he wasn't sure why he was defending himself. "Isn't it? Tell me, Jake Morrison. What do you know about me besides my name and what I look like?" Jake opened his mouth and closed it again. She was right. He knew nothing about her. "I thought so," Isabella said. "Do you know that I speak 4 languages? That I manage the books for this entire ranch? That I've read every book in this library? That I was planning to open a school for the children of our workers?" Jake stared at her. He'd never met a woman like this before. Most of the women he knew could barely read their own names. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "Of course you didn't. Because to you, I'm just some Mexican girl your luck won you in a card game. Well, let me tell you something, cowboy. I am Isabella Valdez, daughter of one of the most respected families in this territory. I was not raised to be anyone's prize or trophy." She walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "Tomorrow we'll be married because my father's honor demands it and your pride won't let you back down. But don't think for one moment that I'll be the quiet, obedient wife you're probably expecting." With that, she left Jake standing alone in the library, surrounded by books and the realization that he'd gotten himself into something far more complicated than he'd ever imagined. That night, Jake lay in his comfortable bed staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow he would marry a woman who was smarter than him, angrier than him, and clearly had no intention of making his life easy. For the first time since sitting down at that poker table, Jake wondered if losing might have been the worst luck of his life. Or maybe, just maybe, the best thing that ever happened to him. The wedding ceremony was small and tense. Jake stood at the altar in his best clothes, which still looked rough compared to everyone else, while Isabella walked down the aisle in a beautiful white dress that probably cost more than he made in 6 months. She looked stunning, but her face was like stone. When the priest asked if she would take Jake as her husband, she said, "I will," in a voice that could have frozen water. Jake's own "I will" sounded more like a question than an answer. When the priest told him to kiss his bride, Isabella turned her cheek to him at the last second. Jake's kiss landed on her smooth skin instead of her lips, and he could feel her body go rigid at his touch. The reception was awkward. Don Ricardo's friends and family were polite but distant. Jake could tell they thought their precious Isabella was too good for some American cowboy. And honestly, he was starting to think they were right. After the guests left, Jake found himself alone with his new wife in what he was told were their rooms. Isabella had already changed out of her wedding dress into a simple day dress. She was sitting at a desk working on what looked like accounting books. "So," Jake said, not sure how to start, "I guess we're married now." "Yes," Isabella replied without looking up from her work. "We are. Maybe we should talk about how this is going to work." Now she did look up and her dark eyes were cold. "It's quite simple. You will live here, eat here, and sleep here. In return, you will work on the ranch and try not to embarrass my family more than necessary." "Sleep here?" Jake asked, looking around the sitting room. "Where exactly?" Isabella pointed to a small couch. "There, the bedroom is mine." Jake felt his face getting hot. "Now wait just a minute. I may not have asked for this marriage, but I am your husband now." "In name only," Isabella said firmly. "Did you really think I would share a bed with a man I barely know? A man who won me in a card game like a horse or a cow?" The words stung because they were true. Jake had been hoping that maybe after they got married, Isabella would warm up to him. Instead, she seemed more distant than ever. The next few days were the hardest of Jake's life. He tried to find his place on the ranch, but everything was different from what he was used to. The workers spoke Spanish, which he didn't understand. The cattle were a different breed. Even the horses seemed to know he didn't belong there. Worst of all, everyone looked at him like he was an intruder. The workers were polite but suspicious. Don Ricardo's family treated him like an unwelcome guest who was staying too long. And Isabella acted like he didn't exist unless she had to. Jake tried to assert himself the way he would on any other ranch. When he saw workers taking a break, he told them to get back to work. When he thought they were doing something wrong, he corrected them. After all, he was part of the family now, wasn't he? But his attempts to take charge only made things worse. The workers would look at him with confusion or anger, then go ask Isabella what they should really do, and Isabella would give them orders in Spanish that usually contradicted whatever Jake had said. One morning, Jake was working with the horses when he overheard two workers talking. His Spanish was terrible, but he caught enough to understand they were talking about him. And they weren't saying nice things. "Hey," he called out. "You got something to say about me, say it in English." The workers looked scared and hurried away, but Isabella appeared from nowhere, her eyes blazing with anger. "Don't you ever talk to my workers like that again," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "Your workers? I thought this was a family ranch." "It is. My family's ranch. These men have worked for us for years. They deserve respect, not to be bullied by some outsider who doesn't understand our ways." "Outsider?" Jake felt his temper explode. "I'm your husband!" "That makes me family." Isabella stepped closer, and Jake could see the fury in her dark eyes. "You think that piece of paper makes you family? Family is earned, not won in a card game. These workers are more family to me than you will ever be." Her words hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd never felt so alone or out of place in his life. That afternoon, Jake decided to show everyone what he could do with horses. He'd always been the best horse breaker on any ranch he'd worked. Surely that would earn him some respect. He picked out a wild stallion that the workers had been trying to break for weeks. The horse was beautiful but mean, and everyone had given up on him. Jake figured if he could break this horse, it would prove his worth. He should have asked Isabella first. He should have talked to the head trainer. But his pride was hurt and he wanted to show off. Jake got the stallion saddled and climbed on. For a few seconds, it looked like it might work. Then the horse exploded into action, bucking and spinning like a tornado. Jake held on for dear life, but the horse was smarter and meaner than any he'd faced before. The horse slammed Jake into the fence, then threw him hard into the dirt. Jake lay there groaning, pretty sure he'd broken at least 2 ribs. When he looked up, he saw Isabella standing over him, her face a mixture of anger and something that might have been concern. "You fool," she said. "That horse killed the last man who tried to ride him." "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Jake gasped, trying to sit up. "Because you didn't ask. You just assumed you knew better than everyone else." Isabella called for help, and 2 workers carefully lifted Jake and carried him to the house. As they cleaned his cuts and bandaged his ribs, Jake felt more embarrassed than hurt. He'd wanted to prove himself, but instead he'd just proven what everyone already thought, that he was a reckless fool who didn't belong there. That evening, Isabella brought him dinner on a tray. It was the first kind thing she'd done since their wedding. "Thank you," Jake said quietly. Isabella sat down in the chair next to his bed. "That horse's name is Diablo. He belonged to my brother." Jake looked up in surprise. Isabella had never mentioned a brother. "Your brother? He died 2 years ago," Isabella said, her voice soft. "He was trying to break Diablo when the horse threw him. He hit his head on a rock and never woke up." Jake felt sick, and not from his injuries. "I'm sorry." "I didn't know." "No, you didn't, just like you don't know that Carlos has been our head trainer for 15 years, or that Maria in the kitchen has been with our family since I was born, or that the man you yelled at today lost his son in the war and is just trying to make a living to feed his wife." Jake stared at the ceiling, ashamed. He'd been so focused on proving himself that he hadn't bothered to learn anything about the people around him. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Isabella was quiet for a long moment. "Because whether I like it or not, you're my husband now. And if you're going to live here, you need to understand that this isn't just a ranch. It's a community. These people aren't just workers, they're part of our family." She stood up to leave, then turned back. "And Jake? That horse you tried to ride today? He's never been broken because he doesn't need to be broken. Some things are meant to stay wild and free." As Isabella left the room, Jake wondered if she was talking about the horse or about herself. The next morning, despite his injuries, Jake went to find Carlos, the head trainer. Using a mixture of bad Spanish and gestures, he apologized for his behavior and asked if he could learn the right way to work with horses on the ranch. Carlos looked surprised, then smiled for the first time since Jake had arrived. "Sí, señor. We teach you." It was a small start, but it was something. And as Jake watched Isabella through the window, discussing business with some of the workers, he realized that earning her respect was going to be much harder than breaking any horse. But for the first time since that fateful card game, Jake Morrison was ready to try doing things the hard way. 3 weeks after the horse incident, Jake was finally starting to find his rhythm on the ranch. His ribs had healed, and more importantly, he'd begun to earn some respect from the workers. Carlos had been teaching him the Mexican way of horse training, which was gentler but more effective than the rough methods Jake was used to. He was working with a young mare when he heard the sound of horses approaching fast. A group of riders was coming up the main road, and they didn't look friendly. Jake counted 6 men, all Americans by the look of them. They were well armed and rode like they owned the place. The leader was a big man with a thick mustache and cold blue eyes. Jake had seen his type before, the kind of man who took what he wanted and didn't worry much about how he got it. Isabella came out of the house to meet them, her face calm but alert. Don Ricardo was away on business, so she was in charge of everything. Jake stayed where he was, but he kept his hand close to his gun. "Good morning, gentlemen," Isabella said politely. "How can I help you?" The big man tipped his hat, but his smile wasn't friendly. "Morning, miss. Name's Bartholomew Crane. I own the Double C Ranch north of here. I was hoping to speak with your father." "My father isn't here," Isabella replied. "Perhaps I can help you with whatever business you have." Crane looked around at his men and chuckled. "Well, now I suppose you might at that. See, I've been expanding my operations and I'm interested in buying some land. Your land, to be specific. Our land isn't for sale, Mr. Crane." Crane's smile disappeared. "Now that's unfortunate, because I'm prepared to make a very generous offer, more generous than you're likely to see from anyone else." "I appreciate your interest," Isabella said, her voice still polite but with an edge of steel. "But as I said, our land isn't for sale. At any price." Jake could see Crane getting angry. The man's face was turning red and his hand was moving toward his gun. This was about to turn ugly. Miss Valdez, Crane said, his voice getting harder. I don't think you understand the situation. This territory is changing. Americans are moving in, and the old ways of doing things are disappearing. It would be smart for folks like your family to adapt to the new reality. And what reality is that, Mr. Crane? The reality that Mexican land grants don't mean as much as they used to. Courts are changing, laws are changing. A smart family would sell now while they can still get a good price. Isabella's eyes flashed dangerously. Are you threatening us, Mr. Crane? Not threatening, just giving friendly advice. Bad things can happen to ranches that don't have proper protection. Cattle can wander off, workers can have accidents, buildings can catch fire. It's a dangerous world out here. That was enough for Jake. He walked over to stand beside Isabella, his hand resting on his gun butt. Sounds like threats to me, Jake said clearly. Crane looked Jake up and down with contempt. And who might you be? Jake Morrison. I'm Mrs. Morrison's husband. The confusion on Crane's face was almost funny. He'd clearly expected Isabella to be unmarried, just another defenseless Mexican girl he could intimidate. Your husband? Crane said, looking back and forth between Jake and Isabella. I wasn't aware you'd married. Recent wedding, Isabella said smoothly. Now, Mr. Crane, I believe you have your answer. Our land is not for sale, and we don't need your protection. Perhaps it's time for you and your men to leave. Crane's face was getting redder by the minute. This isn't over. Like I said, things are changing around here. You'd be wise to remember that. He wheeled his horse around and rode off with his men, kicking up a cloud of dust. Jake and Isabella stood watching until they were completely out of sight. Friend of yours? Jake asked. Hardly. He's been pressuring Mexican families all over the territory to sell their land cheap. Some have given in to his threats. Threats like what? Isabella looked troubled. Cattle killed, workers beaten, barns burned. He's careful to make it look like accidents or random violence, but everyone knows it's him. Jake felt a chill. He'd known men like Crane before, and they didn't give up easily. What's he really after? Water rights, mainly. Our land controls access to the Rio Grande for 50 miles in both directions. Without that access, half the ranches in the territory couldn't survive a dry summer. That made sense. In this part of the world, water was more valuable than gold. And Jake had a feeling Bartholomew Crane wasn't the type to let anything stand between him and what he wanted. 2 days later, Jake's fears were confirmed. Carlos came riding in fast, his face grim. Señora Isabella, he called. There's been trouble. Isabella came out of the house quickly, with Jake right behind her. What happened? It's the South Pasture. Someone killed 30 head of cattle and left them to rot, and they burned the line shack where Pedro and his family were staying. Isabella's face went pale. Is Pedro's family all right? They got out, but just barely. Pedro's boy got burned on his arm trying to save their belongings. Jake felt anger building in his chest. Killing cattle was one thing, but endangering a family with children was something else entirely. Did anyone see who did it? Jake asked. Pedro saw riders in the distance, but it was too dark to make them out. But he found this. Carlos held up a piece of cloth. It was good quality material, the kind worn by wealthy ranchers, and Jake recognized it. He'd seen Bartholomew Crane wearing a shirt made of the same fabric just 2 days ago. Isabella took the cloth and examined it. This is evidence, but not enough to take to the law. Crane will just claim it could have come from anywhere. So what do we do? Jake asked. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Finally, she looked up at Jake with an expression he'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or contempt this time. It was something that might have been respect. We protect our people, she said. All of them. Together. That afternoon, Isabella called a meeting with all the workers and their families. Jake expected to just listen, but Isabella surprised him by asking him to stand beside her as she addressed the crowd. My friends, Isabella said in Spanish, then repeated it in English for Jake's benefit. You all know about the troubles at the South Pasture. This was not an accident. There are people who want to drive us from our land through fear and violence. The crowd murmured angrily. These people had worked for the Valdez family for years. This ranch was their home too. But we will not be driven away, Isabella continued. This is our land, our home, and we will defend it. From now on, no one works alone. Everyone will travel in groups of 3 or more. We will post guards at night, and if anyone sees strangers on our land, you will report it immediately. An older worker raised his hand. What about the law? Can't they help us? Isabella shook her head. The nearest sheriff is 2 days' ride away, and he has made it clear that disputes between Mexican families and American ranchers are not his concern. Jake felt sick hearing that, but he knew it was probably true. Justice wasn't always equal on the frontier, especially for Mexican families. So we protect ourselves, Isabella said, and each other. After the meeting, Jake and Isabella worked together to organize the ranch's defenses. They set up a system of signals using mirrors during the day and lanterns at night. They assigned the best riders to patrol the borders of the property. And Jake began teaching some of the younger men how to handle guns properly. Working side by side with Isabella for the first time, Jake began to see a different side of her. She wasn't just beautiful and intelligent, she was a natural leader. The workers respected her, trusted her, and would follow her anywhere. And slowly, Jake began to realize something that surprised him. He was no longer thinking about this as Isabella's ranch or even Don Ricardo's ranch. Somewhere along the way, without even noticing it, he'd started thinking of it as home. That night, as they finished planning the guard rotations, Isabella looked at Jake with something that might have been approval. "You could have stayed out of this," she said quietly. "Crane is an American like you. You could have sided with him or just stayed neutral." Jake looked her in the eyes. "These people are my neighbors now. My friends." "A man doesn't abandon his friends," Isabella nodded slowly. "No, a good man doesn't." It wasn't much, but it was the first compliment she'd ever given him. And as Jake settled down on his couch that night, he found himself hoping it wouldn't be the last. The attacks continued for 2 weeks. Crane's men were careful and smart, striking at night and disappearing before anyone could catch them. They poisoned waterholes, cut fence lines, and scared cattle into scattering across the desert. Each attack was small enough to look like bad luck, but together they were slowly strangling the ranch. Jake found himself working 18-hour days, riding fence lines, tracking missing cattle, and helping repair damage. Isabella was right beside him through all of it, never complaining, never showing weakness. She would spend her days managing the ranch business and her nights planning defenses, running on just a few hours of sleep. One evening, Jake found her in the library again, surrounded by papers and account books. Her usually perfect hair was falling loose around her shoulders, and there were dark circles under her eyes. "You need to get some rest," Jake said, setting down a cup of coffee beside her. Isabella looked up, surprised. It was the first time he'd brought her anything without being asked. "Thank you," she said softly, "but there's too much to do. I need to figure out how much these attacks are costing us and whether we can afford to hire more guards." Jake sat down across from her. "What do the numbers look like?" Isabella hesitated. She'd never discussed ranch finances with him before, but finally she turned one of the ledgers around so he could see it. "We're losing money fast," she admitted. "Between the destroyed cattle, the damaged property, and the cost of extra security, we can't keep this up much longer." Jake studied the numbers. His arithmetic wasn't great, but he could see the problem. "What if we took the fight to Crane instead of just defending?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if we hit back? Show him we're not going to just sit here and take it." Isabella shook her head. "That would make us no better than him. Besides, he has more men and more guns. We'd lose." Jake leaned back in his chair, thinking. "Maybe, but what if we're smarter about it? You said Crane needs water access. What if we cut off his water supply?" Isabella looked interested despite herself. "Go on. Well, your land controls the river, right? What if we exercise those rights? Make it clear that Crane's cattle can't use the river anymore." "That would be legal," Isabella said slowly. "We do have exclusive water rights from the old Spanish land grant. But it would also escalate things. Crane might do something desperate. He's already doing desperate things. At least this way we're fighting back." They stayed up until nearly dawn, working out the details. Isabella knew the legal side of water rights, while Jake understood the practical aspects of controlling river access. By morning, they had a plan. The next day, Jake and a crew of workers began building barriers along the river where it crossed into Crane's territory. They were careful to stay on Valdez land, but the message was clear. Crane's cattle would have to find water somewhere else. Crane showed up before noon, angrier than Jake had ever seen him. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Crane shouted, pointing at the barriers. Isabella rode up calmly with Jake beside her. "We're exercising our water rights, Mr. Crane, something we should have done long ago. You can't cut off the river. My cattle need water." "Then perhaps you should have thought of that before you began your campaign of harassment," Isabella replied coolly. "The river runs through our land, Mr. Crane. We decide who uses it." Crane's face was purple with rage. "You're making a big mistake, lady. A big mistake. The only mistake," Jake said quietly, "was us being patient with you for this long." Crane looked like he wanted to go for his gun, but he was outnumbered. Instead, he spun his horse around and rode off, cursing loudly. "Well," Isabella said, watching him go, "I suppose we've just declared war." "Seems like it," Jake agreed. "You having second thoughts?" Isabella looked at him with a slight smile, the first real smile he'd seen from her since their wedding. "No, are you?" "Not a chance." That night, they doubled the guards and waited for Crane's response. It came just after midnight, the sound of gunfire from the north pasture. Jake and Isabella rode out with a group of workers to find one of their line shacks in flames and 2 guards wounded. As they tended to the injured men, Isabella's face was grim. "This is my fault. I pushed him too far." "No," Jake said firmly. "This is his fault. He's the one choosing violence over law." One of the wounded guards, a young man named Diego, grabbed Isabella's hand. "Señora, he said to tell you this was just the beginning. He said next time he won't just wound people." Isabella's jaw tightened. "Did you get a good look at him?" "See, it was Crane himself. He wanted us to see his face." Jake felt cold anger settle in his stomach. Crane was done playing games. From now on, people were going to die. Over the next few days, Jake and Isabella worked together more closely than ever before. They planned patrol routes, organized supply runs, and tried to keep morale up among the workers. The constant danger was bringing out the best in both of them. Isabella's intelligence and Jake's practical experience complemented each other perfectly. Late one night, as they reviewed guard reports in the library, Jake realized something had changed between them. Isabella was no longer treating him like an unwanted burden. When she looked at him now, he saw respect and even warmth in her dark eyes. "Jake," she said suddenly, "can I ask you something?" "Sure. Why did you really stand up to Crane that first day? You could have just stayed quiet. It would have been easier." Jake thought about it. "I guess because it was the right thing to do." "And because—" He paused, not sure how to put his feelings into words. "Because what?" "Because watching him threaten you made me angry in a way I'd never felt before." Isabella stared at him for a long moment. "You were protecting me." "I was protecting my wife," Jake said quietly. The word wife hung in the air between them. For the first time since their wedding, it didn't sound like a legal technicality. "I owe you an apology," Isabella said finally. "For what?" "For treating you like an enemy. You didn't choose this situation any more than I did. But you've made the best of it. You've tried to fit in here, learn our ways, protect our people. That takes a good man." Jake felt warmth spread through his chest. "I'm still learning. About this place, about your family, about you." Isabella's cheeks turned slightly pink. "What have you learned about me?" "That you're the strongest person I've ever met. That you care more about other people than yourself. That you're smarter than me in every way that matters." He paused. "And that I was a fool to think I won you in a card game. Nobody could ever win you. You can only earn you." Isabella looked down at her hands. "Jake!" Before she could finish, they heard shouts from outside. Jake grabbed his rifle and ran for the door, with Isabella right behind him. In the courtyard, they found chaos. Crane had brought at least 20 men this time. They had surrounded the main house and were demanding that Isabella come out to talk. Some of the buildings were already on fire, and Jake could hear the sound of cattle being driven away. "This ends tonight, lady," Crane shouted. "You can sell me that land or I can take it from your corpse." Jake and Isabella looked at each other. This was it, the final confrontation. And despite all their planning and preparation, they were outnumbered and surrounded. "Any ideas?" Jake asked quietly. Isabella checked her rifle with steady hands. "Just one. We fight," Jake nodded. "Together?" Isabella met his eyes, and for the first time since their wedding night, she smiled at him with genuine affection. Together. As they prepared to face Crane's army, Jake realized that somewhere in the middle of this war he'd fallen in love with his wife. And from the way Isabella was looking at him, he had a feeling she might be starting to feel the same way. Now they just had to survive long enough to find out. The battle lasted until dawn. Jake and Isabella fought side by side, coordinating the ranch's defense while Crane's men attacked from multiple directions. The workers proved to be brave fighters, but they were still outnumbered 2-1. Jake was crouched behind an overturned wagon, reloading his rifle, when he heard Isabella cry out. He turned to see her stumble and fall, blood spreading across her white shirt. Isabella! Jake ran toward her, not caring about the bullets whizzing past his head. He reached her just as she collapsed against the side of a building. How bad is it? He asked, trying to examine her wound while keeping watch for attackers. My shoulder, she gasped. I think the bullet went through. Jake could see she was right, but she was losing a lot of blood. He pressed his bandana against the wound to try to stop the bleeding. You need to get to the house, he said. Let Maria take care of this. No. Isabella tried to sit up. I can't leave now. Yes, you can. Carlos and I can handle things out here. Isabella grabbed his arm with her good hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Jake, listen to me. If something happens to me tonight, there's something you need to know. Nothing's going to happen to you. Promise me you'll listen. Something in her voice made Jake pay attention. All right, I'm listening. In my room behind the bookshelf, there's a hidden safe. The combination is my mother's birthday, 3/15/1852. Isabella, you're scaring me. Why are you telling me this? Because what's in that safe? It's not what you think. The money my father talked about, my dowry, it's not just family money. Jake was confused. What do you mean? Isabella winced as another wave of pain hit her. For the past 3 years, I've been working with other Mexican families throughout the territory. We pool our resources to buy back land that American settlers have taken illegally. Buy back land? Land that was stolen through false documents, intimidation, or outright fraud. We find families who want to sell, and we pay them fair prices to return the land to its rightful Mexican owners. Jake stared at her. How much land are we talking about? Thousands of acres. Enough to make a real difference for dozens of families. Isabella's voice was getting weaker. The money in that safe, it's not just mine. It belongs to all of us. A bullet splinged off the wall above their heads, reminding Jake that they were still in the middle of a fight. But he had to understand what Isabella was telling him. Why are you keeping this secret? Because if the wrong people found out, they'd try to stop us. Men like Crane would see it as a threat to their plans to control all the land in the territory. Jake's mind was racing. So when your father offered you as a bet, he was protecting the network. If I married an American, especially one who won me in a card game, it would look like I was just a traditional Mexican daughter with no real power. No one would suspect what I was really doing. Jake felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. So this whole marriage, everything, it was all part of some plan? Isabella's eyes filled with tears. At first, yes. But Jake, that's not how I feel now. These past weeks fighting beside you, seeing how you've tried to fit in here, how you've protected our people, I've fallen in love with you. Before Jake could respond, Carlos appeared beside them. Senora, we need to fall back to the house. They've broken through the east fence. Jake helped Isabella to her feet, his mind spinning with everything she'd just told him. As they made their way across the courtyard, dodging bullets and burning debris, he tried to process what he'd learned. His wife wasn't just a rich Mexican girl who read books. She was running an underground network that was quietly fighting American land grabbers throughout the territory. She was some kind of revolutionary. They made it to the main house where Maria quickly took charge of treating Isabella's wound. Jake posted guards at all the windows and tried to figure out their next move. That's when he heard Crane shouting from outside. Morrison, I know you can hear me? Send the girl out and maybe the rest of you live through this. Jake opened a window just enough to shout back. Go to hell, Crane. Have it your way. Boys burn everything. Jake watched in horror as Crane's men began setting fire to every building they could reach. The stables, the bunkhouses, the equipment sheds. Everything was going up in flames. They're trying to burn us out, Carlos said grimly. Jake nodded. It was a smart strategy. The main house was made of stone, so it wouldn't burn easily. But if they destroyed everything else, the ranch would be ruined even if the family survived. How long until help arrives? Jake asked. Carlos shook his head. Don Ricardo won't be back for 3 days. And the nearest neighbors are a day's ride away. They were on their own. Jake went to check on Isabella. She was lying on her bed looking pale but determined. Maria had bandaged her shoulder, but she'd lost a lot of blood. How are you feeling? Jake asked. Like I've been shot. Isabella replied with a weak smile. But I'll live. Good. Because when this is over, we need to talk about this secret network of yours. Isabella's expression became serious. Are you angry? Jake thought about it. I don't know, maybe. You've been lying to me since the day we met. Not lying, just not telling you everything. Is there anything else I should know? Any other secrets? Isabella hesitated. The safe I told you about. There are also documents in there. Names of families in our network. Records of land purchases. Letters from allies in other territories. If Crane gets hold of that information, he could destroy your entire operation and get dozens of families killed or driven from their homes. Jake understood now why Isabella had been so secretive. The work she was doing wasn't just dangerous, it was revolutionary. If the wrong people found out about it, it could start a war between Mexican and American settlers. A loud crash from downstairs interrupted his thoughts. Jake grabbed his rifle and ran to investigate. Crane's men had broken down the front door and were pouring into the house. Jake and Carlos met them in the main hallway, and a fierce gun battle erupted. Jake fought like a man possessed, thinking about Isabella lying wounded upstairs and all the families depending on her network. These weren't just his neighbors anymore, they were his people, and he'd be damned if he'd let Crane destroy them. But there were too many attackers. Slowly, Jake and Carlos were forced to retreat up the stairs. Soon they'd be trapped on the second floor with nowhere to go. That's when Jake heard something that made his heart sink. The sound of horses approaching from the east. More of Crane's men. But as the riders got closer, Jake realized the voices were shouting in Spanish. And leading the charge was Don Ricardo, with what looked like half the Mexican ranchers in the territory riding behind him. Looks like help has arrived, Jake said to Carlos with a grin. The battle turned quickly after that, caught between Jake's group in the house and Don Ricardo's reinforcements outside. Crane's men found themselves outnumbered and surrounded. When the sun finally rose, Bartholomew Crane was in chains, and his surviving men were riding away as fast as their horses could carry them. Jake found Isabella sitting up in bed, looking much better despite her bandaged shoulder. "So," he said, settling into the chair beside her bed, "ready to tell me the rest of your secrets?" Isabella smiled. "All of them. But first I need to know something." "What?" "Now that you know who I really am and what I really do you still want to be married to me?" Jake looked at this woman he'd won in a card game and lost his heart to in a war. She was beautiful, brilliant, brave, and apparently some kind of secret revolutionary. She was nothing like what he'd expected when he'd sat down at that poker table. She was so much more. "Isabella Morrison," Jake said, taking her hand in his. "I wouldn't have you any other way." 3 months after the battle, Jake thought their troubles with Bartholomew Crane were over. The man was in jail in the territorial capital, awaiting trial for multiple charges including cattle theft, arson, and attempted murder. The ranch had been rebuilt, Isabella's shoulder had healed completely, and life had settled into a peaceful routine. Jake had even moved from the couch into the bedroom he shared with his wife. Their marriage had become real in every sense of the word, built on respect, trust, and genuine love. Isabella had shown him all the documents in her secret safe, and Jake had become a full partner in her network of Mexican land buyers. That morning started like any other. Jake was working with Carlos to train some new horses when a rider approached at full speed. It was Pedro, one of their scouts, and his face was grim. "Señor Jake." "Señora Isabella." "Come quickly." Jake and Isabella met Pedro in the courtyard, where he delivered news that made their blood run cold. "Crane has escaped from jail," Pedro gasped, still catching his breath from his hard ride. "But that's not the worst part. He's taken Señora Isabella with him." "What?" Jake felt the world spin around him. "That's impossible. Isabella is right here." But when he turned around, Isabella was gone. Pedro shook his head sadly. "No, señor. That was yesterday. Crane and 6 men came to the house while you were out checking the north fence. They took her at gunpoint." Jake's mind raced. Yesterday? But he'd seen Isabella at breakfast that morning, hadn't he? Then he remembered. He'd left before dawn to check on some missing cattle. He'd been gone all day and had come home after dark, exhausted. He'd assumed Isabella was already asleep. "Where did they take her?" Jake demanded. Pedro handed him a piece of paper. "Crane left this for you." Jake's hands shook as he read the note. "Morrison, your wife is safe for now. If you want to see her alive again, bring the deed to the Valdez Ranch to Devil's Canyon tomorrow at noon. Come alone, try any tricks, and the girl dies." B. Crane Devil's Canyon was a narrow, rocky gorge about 20 miles north of the ranch. It was the perfect place for an ambush, surrounded by high cliffs with only one way in or out. "It's a trap," Carlos said, reading the note over Jake's shoulder. "He'll kill you both." Jake knew Carlos was right, but he also knew he had no choice. "Maybe, but I can't just leave her there." Don Ricardo, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward. "We'll gather the men. 50 riders can be ready within the hour." "No," Jake said firmly. "The note says to come alone. If he sees a group of riders, he might panic and hurt Isabella." "So what do you propose?" Don Ricardo asked. Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking. The old Jake Morrison would have ridden to Devil's Canyon with guns blazing, trusting to luck and quick reflexes, but living with Isabella had taught him that sometimes the smart approach was better than the bold one. "I need to know exactly what Crane wants," Jake said finally, "and I need to understand why he's doing this now." Isabella had taught Jake to think like she did, to look for the real motivations behind people's actions. Crane had been in jail for 3 months. Why escape now? Why risk everything for revenge against one ranch family? That's when Jake remembered something Isabella had told him about her network. They weren't just buying back Mexican land. They were also gathering evidence of illegal American land grabs. Evidence that could destroy powerful men throughout the territory. "Pedro," Jake said suddenly, "when Crane took Isabella, did he say anything else?"
Anything about what he really wanted?
Pedro thought for a moment. "See, he said something about papers. He kept asking about papers she was hiding." Jake's blood ran cold. Crane wasn't just after revenge, he was after the documents in Isabella's network. Names, locations, evidence of crimes, information that could hang a lot of powerful men. "Don Ricardo," Jake said urgently, "I need you to send riders to warn everyone in Isabella's network. Tell them to hide their families and burn any documents they have. Crane isn't just after us, he's after all of them." Don Ricardo nodded grimly. "It will be done." "But what about Isabella?" Jake looked toward the north, where Devil's Canyon lay hidden among the rocky hills. "I'm going to get her back, but not the way Crane expects." That evening, Jake met with Carlos and Don Ricardo to plan the rescue. Instead of riding straight into Crane's trap, they would use Isabella's own tactics: intelligence, preparation, and turning Crane's strengths against him. Jake would go to Devil's Canyon as demanded, but he wouldn't go unprepared. Carlos would take a group of their best men and circle around to approach the canyon from the backside. A dangerous climb, but possible for experienced riders. Don Ricardo would wait with more men 5 miles away, ready to move if things went wrong. Most importantly, Jake would bring a fake deed, one that looked real but was actually worthless. If Crane wanted to play games with documents, Jake would play games right back. The next morning, Jake set out for Devil's Canyon with the fake deed in his saddlebags and a heavy heart. He'd never been so scared in his life, but not for himself. The thought of losing Isabella, really losing her, was more terrifying than facing any gunman. Devil's Canyon was exactly as treacherous as Jake had remembered. The walls rose steep and high on both sides, and the narrow floor was littered with boulders that could hide dozens of men. Jake rode slowly, his hands visible and his gun holstered, but his eyes constantly scanning for threats. He found Crane waiting in a small clearing near the back of the canyon. The man looked different from when Jake had last seen him. Thinner, harder, with the desperate look of a man who had nothing left to lose. Isabella was tied to a tree nearby, but she appeared unharmed. When she saw Jake, relief flooded her face. "Right on time, Morrison," Crane called out. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Let her go, Crane. I brought what you wanted." "The deed?" "Show me." Jake pulled out the fake document and held it up. "Let Isabella go first," Crane laughed. "You think I'm stupid? I want to see that deed up close before anyone goes anywhere." Jake rode closer, trying to spot Crane's hidden men. He counted at least 4, probably more. Even if Carlos had made it into position, this was going to be a tough fight. "Here's your deed," Jake said, handing over the document. Crane examined it carefully. For a moment, Jake thought he might actually fall for the fake. Then Crane's face darkened with rage. "You think you're clever, don't you, Morrison? This deed is worthless. It's not even signed properly." "It's the deed to the ranch," Jake said, trying to buy time. "It's a fake, and we both know it." Crane drew his gun and pointed it at Isabella. "Here's what's really going to happen. Your wife is going to tell me where she's hidden all those documents about land purchases. Then she's going to give me the names of everyone in her little network. And if she doesn't, I'll never tell you anything," Isabella said defiantly. Crane's smile was cruel. Oh, I think you will. You see, I don't need to hurt you to make you talk. I just need to hurt your husband. Before Jake could react, two of Crane's men grabbed him from behind. They wrestled his gun away and held him while Crane approached with a length of rope. Let's see how long your wife's principles last while she watches you hang, Crane said. That's when the first shot rang out from the canyon walls. Carlos and his men had made it into position and were firing down at Crane's group. In the confusion that followed, Jake broke free from his captors and dove for his gun. The battle was short but vicious. Crane's men were caught in a crossfire between Jake on the canyon floor and Carlos's group on the walls above. Within minutes, most of them were down, but Crane still had Isabella and he was backing toward his horse with his gun pressed to her head. Stay back, he shouted. I'll kill her. Jake raised his hands, but he kept walking forward. It's over, Crane. Your men are finished and the territorial marshal is probably on his way here by now. I said stay back. You're not going to kill her, Jake said calmly, because she's the only thing keeping you alive right now. Crane's eyes were wild with desperation. You don't think I'll do it? I think you're a lot of things, but you're not crazy. Kill Isabella, and you've got nothing to bargain with. Don Ricardo and every Mexican rancher in the territory will hunt you down. Jake could see Crane wavering. The man was trapped, and he knew it. Besides, Jake continued, what you really want isn't revenge. It's those documents. And Isabella isn't the only one who knows where they are. That was a lie, but Crane didn't know that. What are you saying? Crane demanded. I'm saying let her go and maybe we can work out a deal. Kill her, and you get nothing. For a long moment, the canyon was silent except for the sound of wind through the rocks. Then slowly Crane lowered his gun. All right, Morrison, let's make a deal. But as soon as the gun was away from Isabella's head, she acted. She stomped hard on Crane's foot and broke away from him, running toward Jake. Crane, caught off guard and in pain, raised his gun to shoot Isabella in the back. But Jake was ready. His own gun was in his hand and firing before Crane could pull the trigger. Bartholomew Crane fell backward into the dust and didn't get up again. Jake ran to Isabella and gathered her in his arms. She was shaking but unharmed. Are you all right? He asked, holding her tight. I am now, she whispered. I knew you'd come for me. Always, Jake said. I'll always come for you. As Carlos and his men climbed down from the canyon walls to help clean up the mess. 6 months after the showdown at Devil's Canyon, Jake and Isabella stood on the porch of their rebuilt ranch house, watching the sun set over their land. The place looked better than ever. New buildings, healthy cattle, and fields green with crops. But the biggest changes weren't to the buildings or the land. They were to the people. Jake had learned to read and write in both English and Spanish, spending hours each evening with Isabella and some of the older workers who were patient enough to teach him. He could now handle the ranch's business correspondence and had even started keeping his own journal. More importantly, he'd become Isabella's full partner in her underground network. What had started as a secret operation to buy back stolen Mexican land had grown into something much larger. They now helped families throughout the Southwest recover property, find legal representation, and protect themselves from land grabbers like Bartholomew Crane. The Martinez family got their deed back today, Isabella said, reading a letter that had arrived that morning. That's 12 families this month. 12 families who can sleep peacefully in their own homes, Jake replied. That's something to be proud of. Isabella smiled and took his hand. We make a good team, don't we? Jake was about to answer when they heard the sound of horses approaching. A group of well-dressed riders was coming up the main road, not the kind of visitors they usually saw on the ranch. As the group got closer, Jake recognized the lead rider. It was Judge William Hayes, the territorial judge who had presided over Crane's trial and sentencing. With him were several other official-looking men in expensive suits. Wonder what this is about? Jake muttered. Don Ricardo came out of the house to greet their visitors. After exchanging pleasantries, Judge Hayes asked if he could speak privately with Jake and Isabella. They gathered in the library, where Judge Hayes got straight to business. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, I've come here today on behalf of the territorial government. We have a proposition for you. Jake and Isabella exchanged glances. What kind of proposition? Isabella asked. Judge Hayes opened his briefcase and pulled out several official-looking documents. Over the past year, Your efforts to resolve land disputes peacefully have not gone unnoticed. The crane incident brought a lot of attention to the problems we're facing throughout the territory. American settlers taking Mexican land illegally, Mexican families losing property they've owned for generations, and violence erupting when legal solutions can't be found. Jake nodded. It's a big problem. Bigger than most people realize. Exactly. And that's why we need people like you to help solve it. People who understand both sides of the issue and have proven they can bring different groups together. Isabella leaned forward, interested. What exactly are you asking us to do? We want to offer you official positions as territorial mediators. Your job would be to investigate land disputes, help families understand their legal rights, and work out fair solutions before conflicts turn violent. Jake stared at the judge. You want to make what we've been doing legal? Judge Hayes smiled. Not just legal, official. You'd be working directly for the territorial government, with full authority to investigate claims, examine documents, and make recommendations to the courts. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Finally, she asked, what about the families we're already helping? The network we've built? That would become part of your official duties. Instead of working in secret and risking accusations of illegal activity, you'd be operating with the full backing of territorial law. Jake felt excitement building in his chest. This could really make a difference. A huge difference, Judge Hayes agreed. We estimate there are hundreds of disputed land claims throughout the Southwest. With your help, we could resolve most of them fairly and peacefully. Isabella had more questions. Would we still live here on the ranch? Absolutely. This would be your home base. We'd expect you to travel throughout the territory as needed, but the ranch would remain your primary residence. And we'd have authority to investigate any land dispute. Any dispute involving claims that date back to Spanish or Mexican land grants, yes. That covers about 60% of the territory. Jake looked at Isabella. This was exactly the kind of work she'd been passionate about since before he'd even met her. And now they were being offered the chance to do it openly, with official support and legal authority. There's one more thing, Judge Hayes added. This position would make you both quite well known throughout the territory. Your story, how you met, how you overcame your differences, how you've worked together to help other families. It's already becoming something of a legend. Isabella laughed. A legend? Think about it. A cowboy who lost a bet and had to marry a woman he'd never met. A Mexican heiress who was forced to marry an American stranger. Two people from completely different worlds who not only fell in love, but became partners in fighting injustice. People are calling it the most romantic story on the frontier. Jake felt his cheeks getting red. I don't know about romantic. We just did what needed doing. Which is exactly why you're perfect for this job, Judge Hayes said. You don't see yourselves as heroes or legends. You just see problems that need solving and people who need help. Isabella stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the ranch where she'd grown up and where she'd learned to love the man she'd been forced to marry. Jake, she said finally, what do you think? Jake joined her at the window. Below them, he could see Carlos working with the horses, Maria hanging laundry, and the children of their workers playing in the courtyard. This place had become more than just a home to him. It was the center of a community that included people from both sides of the border. I think, Jake said slowly, that we've been doing this work anyway. Might as well do it where it can help the most people. Isabella turned back to Judge Hayes. We accept your offer. The paperwork was signed that same day. Within a week, news of their appointment had spread throughout the territory. Jake Morrison and Isabella Valdez. Morrison, the cowboy and the heiress who had bridged two worlds, were now the official territorial mediators for land disputes. Their first official case came just 2 weeks later. A family of American settlers in the southern part of the territory claimed they had legally purchased land from a Mexican family. But the Mexican family insisted they had never agreed to sell, and that the documents were forged. Jake and Isabella rode south with their official credentials and their growing reputation. What they found was exactly the kind of complex situation they were meant to handle. The American family, the Johnsons, were honest people who had paid good money for what they believed was clear title to the land. They had built a house, planted crops, and started raising cattle. They weren't trying to cheat anyone. The Mexican family, the Herreras, had owned the land for 3 generations. They spoke little English and had been tricked by a dishonest land agent into signing papers they couldn't read. They thought they were agreeing to let the Americans use part of their land, not sell it entirely. The old Jake Morrison might have automatically sided with the American family. The old Isabella might have assumed the Americans were trying to steal Mexican land. But together, they looked for a solution that could work for everyone. After 3 days of investigation, they discovered that the land agent had indeed forged documents and kept most of the money that was supposed to go to the Herrera family. More importantly, they found that there was enough land for both families to live comfortably. The solution they proposed was simple but fair. The Johnsons could keep the land where they had built their house and planted their crops. The Herreras would keep the rest of their ancestral property, and the dishonest land agent would be prosecuted and forced to pay damages to both families. Both families were satisfied with the arrangement, and word of the fair resolution spread quickly throughout the territory. Over the next year, Jake and Isabella handled dozens of similar cases. Each one was different, but they approached them all the same way, with careful investigation, respect for both sides, and a commitment to finding solutions that honored both law and justice. The work took them all over the Southwest. They mediated disputes in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Everywhere they went, they met families whose stories reminded them of their own, people from different backgrounds who had been forced together by circumstances and had to learn to understand each other. But the real surprise came when they were summoned to the territorial capital for a meeting with the governor himself. Governor Bradford was a tall, serious man who got straight to business. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, in the past year, you've successfully resolved over 200 land disputes. More importantly, you've done it without a single case resulting in violence. We've been lucky, Jake said. It's not luck, the governor replied. It's skill, fairness, and the fact that people trust you. Both American and Mexican families see you as honest brokers who understand their concerns. Isabella leaned forward. Is there something specific you need us to do? Governor Bradford smiled. As a matter of fact, there is. Congress is considering legislation that would establish a permanent commission to handle land disputes throughout all the Western territories. They've asked me to recommend people who could run such a commission.